As for the topic of my talk today, just a few qualifications about the wording in the title. Tibetan here means people who were subjects of or agents of the Ganden Pogrom state in the first half of the 20th century. Because this term Tibetans can cover such a wide range of things. So that's how I intend to use it right now. The Far Eastern Himalaya, I'll show you some maps, but for the purposes of this talk, it means everything, the high mountain zone from the east of the Monual Corridor, the Tawang Sona area on the map, all the way over to Zayu, in the very far southeast of the Tibetan Plateau. And the reason I've chosen this time frame, about 1900 up to the 1950s, is for what I'm going to talk about. Before 1900, there are very few reliable sources, and I'm always looking for independent witnesses when I do my research. We have to finish in the 1950s because I want to talk about an area that I define as being stateless. The area I'm talking about up on the McMahon line in the east of the Himalayas was incorporated into the Indian state in the 1950s, and the relationship with Tibetans of the Highland peoples finished in 1962 with the Sino-Indian conflict. Now, one kind of thing I want to come back to at the end of my talk, but I'll mention it now, is that this Far Eastern Himalaya is quite an exceptional place for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's the least known part of the Himalaya from the point of view of scholarship. Yeah? And there are good political reasons for that. Lack of access by all sorts of observers. And we don't have to talk about the reasons for that, everybody knows them. The second point is that through the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the boundaries here in red are the states that neighboured the Ganden Pogrom, the frontiers of those states, Bhutan, the northern border of Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal, the western Himalayan part of British India, and the area over here bordering on China and the eastern Tibetan polities were quite firm in a way. They were not fluid, ambivalent places, and the people within the Ganden Pogrom simply could not go over the border and do whatever they wanted and get away with it. There was a reaction from the state or some local polity. But this area, the southeast and the far east of the Himalayas, was exceptional in the fact that the whole highland zone was populated by small independent groups of Tibeto-Burman speaking persons, and who we usually call tribals. And this is what the literature calls them. They actually call themselves tribals today, and they're proud of that because it distinguishes them from the plains people who speak Indo-European languages. So I forget about all the anthropological arguments about tribe. I might use that word a few times. So what we have here is a stateless area bordering on the Ganden Pogrom state, and I want to look at the relationship between the Tibetans and these Highland peoples during this part of time. Now, by way of background, two things happened here. The McMahon line was formed in 1914. And the inner line was drawn along the southern boundary of the foothills of the far eastern Himalaya. The British pushed their administrative influence up until 1947, only about a third of the way up. I mean, this is a very rough boundary. Their influence only spread up in altitude towards the McMahon line very slowly. So it meant, up until the middle of the 20th century, all these highland areas were still settled by independent Tibeto-Burman tribal groups. They were not under the sway of any state, whatever claims people made in governments far away from here who thought they controlled this area. Now, when we look at the Tibetan state, of course, it operated up to the McMahon line as well. And the McMahon line, quite logically, followed the high altitude crest summit of the Himalayan range here, and for all intents and purposes, it divided two ethnic and linguistic and ecological worlds from one another. There were certain permeable areas, exceptions to that, but in general it worked quite It was quite an accurate kind of boundary to draw. The Tibetans, I've mapped some of the major dzong or administrative centre that the Gunmen program maintained within 50 kilometres or so of the McMahon line in this area, and there's a lot of them. Yeah, it was quite heavily administered compared to other parts of the Gunmen program state. There were also, in addition to the Gunmen program administrative centres, individual entities which had claims just to the south of the McMahon line. Very briefly, and very well known, of course, is the Drepung interest in Tawang and the Millennium Corridor as a source of tax revenues and other religious interests and so on. Some Podrang collected taxes from the Drokmas of Mago. The Lalu family had a small estate here in an area called Beijing, which is called Pachakshiri in the British English language literature, today called Bechuka, part of Arunachal Pradesh. And the Sera Monastery had interests in the Mekop Dzong in Pemaka. So, you know, these are the sort of sum of the state and other entities within the government program which had interests in this area, politically and economically. Now, one thing we have to know is that until the whole of the first half of the 20th century, but centuries before, Tibetans had a certain mindset towards this piece of their frontier. And it's the same mindset that we heard talked about from Chinese perspective of what the Tibetans were. The Chinese saw the Tibetans as barbarians on their periphery. The Tibetans saw the people who lived in the far eastern Himalaya as barbarians on their periphery. The area was seen as marginal to all the types of Tibetan cosmologies that we have records of, and to the organisational systems like the Dzong system of the state. The area was labelled as Tangkop, which means on the margins, the very margins of civilization. The people there were generically labelled as Loba, which really means something like barbarian or savage. The characteristics of Loba, which we find time and time again written about in Tibetan literature, and many Tibetans I've interviewed in the last 20 years about the Loba, there's always three reactions. You laugh, they laugh when you first mention Loba, or they don't say anything, or they say something very negative about it. And this is because Loba are always seen as being brutal, ignorant, somehow untrustworthy, you can't trust them, people who are wild and primitive, and also promiscuous. Now, not all Tibetans think of the people in the far east of the Himalaya, the highlands, like this, but this is a very, very common kind of attitude, especially for the historical period I was talking about. The upshot of this, in terms of discourse, is that these people need to be controlled somehow. They need to be suppressed or civilized. And these Tibetan terms here, Mumbai and Durba, they are mentioned time and time again in the Tibetan discourses about this area. So that's the kind of ideal discourse about this place. What about the way Tibetans practiced in relation to it? Just very quickly. This border area, from the point of view of the state, was a place of political banishment. Where political enemies or traitors were sent there. Yeah? They were sent away to the edge of civilization, to rot away in prisons. In fact, there's some quite famous prisons in this area. People who came across the Himalaya from the so-called Loba territories were strictly controlled. They were never allowed to stay overnight in any Tibetan settlements. They weren't usually allowed to travel more than a day's walk from the border passes to the trading, and so on and so forth. The third point is, from the point of view of the Tibetan state, there was no hesitation to use political violence in this area. From the point of view of Tibetan individuals, the southeast part of the plateau, this far eastern Himalaya, was a place of flight. Lots of people ran away here to get away from one thing or another. Especially, we have many, many documented cases of people who were so-called mibok. They were under a lease system to an estate lord or estate. They were bonded for life, and they could run away from this. Where do you go? You know, so you go down here to the edge of the world. Yeah, hi. Many criminals also went down, and many stories about Tibetan criminals ending up in this area for one reason or another, or you went into self-imposed exile to run away from your enemies. Secondly, many individuals went to this area for ritual journeys, pilgrimages, or seeking utopian places like Belu, these hidden lands of promise. But all of these journeys were very high risk. That's the general characteristic they all had in this area. Thirdly, we find individual Tibetans going there on conversion or civilizing missions, and these are usually Buddhist lamas of one form or another, very often turn these treasure seekers. Just quickly, I've identified two penal settlements or quite well-known prisons on the border, Trun and Wallong, just for information about how this border was used. I don't want to talk about the religious dynamics here. I'm sticking to politics and the economic interests of Tibet in this area today. But there were three quite well-known pilgrimage areas: Nebhemekur, Tsarayima, and Sarisama. I, of course, worked on Tsarayima a lot, and I published a monograph on it. That made me interested in this area, so this research is a kind of follow-on from that. Now, as far as the scholarship on this area goes from a Tibetan point of view, it's almost all about religious activity. That's why I'm trying to fill in this big gap about what were the political and economic interests in the area. As for the local Tibeto-Burman speaking Highlanders, they were a very complex set of peoples. And one way to try and simplify an introduction to you about them is to do it by general linguistic groupings of the non-Tibetanized groups, the people who are called Logas. Because the Tibetanized groups over here in the Tawang and Minyul corridor were not called Logas, they were called Burma. So there are these three general language groups here. They're fairly ill-defined, they need lots of research, but for our purposes it's good enough today. I'm interested in the Tani-speaking area, and the Tanis who live right along the Mekong line. That's where I've worked since 2002, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. All my examples come from that area, although I have lots of examples from the Nishmi-speaking area, and a certain amount from Kodwa, people who live on the border. So if we just look at one small piece of this Tani-speaking area in the north, we see how complex the ethnic situation is there. The so-called Loba, there were many different types of Loba, and the Tibetans recognized this. They had names for all sorts of different people just across the passes to the south who were Loba. But the autonyms, the names these people call themselves, at least today, I've just given you here, and I've tried to color code them so you know what I'm talking about. Within this Dani-speaking border area, there were two pockets of people who are now called Mena. The Pachashiriwa and some group of Mimpas in here mixed with Kambas. I can't go into the details about the history of them, but they were not Dani speakers. They were people who spoke a mixture of Sangla languages and Konke, Kongpo Tibetan, and Dani languages and Kamba dialects. So it's they're very complex communities. Many people have said that these are all pure Sangha speaking movements, but that's not true. They're much more complicated than that. Anyway, just a few quick visual impressions. We have a few photographs of people who were called Loba, and we can identify them now by their own names for themselves. The Upper Subansiri, an example of a Mra man belonging to the Mra tribe. Some women from the Shimon tribe who belong to the bigger Adigawan group in the Upper Sian River Valley. Puruik, who are also known as Sulum, who are classified as Kodwa speakers, and they live over in the west of this area I'm talking about. But they very frequently live together with Dani speakers, Bangmi people. So they're a bit of an exception. This is an example of a Bangmi man who was Puruik slaves in the Upper Kambla River, just west of the Subansiri. A very rare photo from 1921 of Mra and Tibetans. The Tibetans are over here. You can see they're wearing their cloth-cut clothes. and Mra traders trading, the border village at Sari, some a Na couple, Upper Subansiri, a Na big man, Manfa, and finally Pachachiriwa, who is one of these from this very heterogeneous population, which is now today called Memba. So these are the people who the Tibetans are interfacing with. And I want to give you a few case studies now of the types of activities that Tibetans were doing, undertaking south of the McMahon line into the territory of these tribal peoples. Now I have dozens of examples of this. It's taken me 20 years to get this material together because it's based on oral histories from Tibetans who lived in the area, oral histories from the Dani groups, Tibetan documents, archival documents from the British and Indian administration, and Tibetan textual sources. I've just chosen these ones because I have at least 3 independent witnesses for each example, so they're very strong and detailed materials. The first one is the story of, in about 1900, of a guy called Dewa Tumdin and the member who go into the Ramo Paribo country. I think I'll just go back to the map now. So the Ramo and the Paribo live here, and somebody's come down from Tibet into their territory. We think Dewa Tumdin was a Tibetan tax agent who worked for the Lala family, who might have been based in Gasha. He took a party of between 15 and 20 armed men who were Pachachiriwa down into the Siom River, into this area here. He mapped all the watercourses and all the settlements of the Ramo and the Paribo, and then proceeded to ask from everybody to pay an annual tax to himself. Yeah? And he had all his armed member agents with him. This had never happened before, as far as we know. He mapped and demanded taxes all the way down to what is presently called Tato at the river junction. That's 50 kilometers south of the McMahon line. He was assassinated by Paribo, and some of his assistants were also killed. The member riflemen had all of their possessions taken from them, including their clothing, and they were sent back up to the border again on fear of death. 1906, we have another account of an incursion into the Na territory from Chayu through here, in the Upper Sudan Syria. The Na tribe, who lived in this orange area, lived around Lung, right on the McMahon line. They traded with a partner village of Trun, which is on the Tibetan side, and that village was under the control of Chayuzong, Gaman Kodram, administrative centre. In 1905, the Na who traded with Trinpa villagers switched their allegiance to Sangmachurling, which is a Drukpa monastery to the north and west of Tsar. And of course, the Trinpas lost all of their trade profits. So to punish the Na, they ambushed them, and because they were going bankrupt. And they killed 70 Na in the first fight. Then there were 2 more fights after that, and another 70 Na died. There's 140 people on the Na side who died. The surviving Na then attacked Tsari, the sacred pilgrimage area of Tsarinimba, and looted one of the monasteries there. And when the news of this looting was sent north to the Dzongs, Kurab Namgye Dzong raised 500 soldiers, which they sent down to Jayu, and they attacked the Na. They went over the Khmer line and drove the Na down into the Subansiri gorges. And then the Na effectively lost their territory because they ended up down here. Now, the third example starts in 1920, and the example I've just given about the Na being pushed down to the Subansiri and losing their territory is a prelude to this one. In 1920, Dasan Dundul Sarong also was visiting the Na area. He was set as military commander to attend the Tsarirong Rongpo Chembo this big pilgrimage that went around the holy mountain of Sari and crossed through Mara and Na territory every year, for which the Tibetan government had to pay a tax to these people. Otherwise, the pilgrimage would be attacked. Anyway, Sarong sent, the sources differ, either 50 or 125 troops around the pilgrimage with himself. He took a tax of 1 tanka from every pilgrim as a kind of protection money. Then he led the pilgrimage around with these troops. A Na or a Ma man stole the load from one of Sarong's quarters. That man was captured, flogged, and then shot on Sarong's quarters, and he died. When he died, of course, the other Na and Ra attacked the pilgrims. The death tolls that are reported from, we have 3 Siamese pilgrims, eyewitnesses account for this incident. 300 pilgrims died and 50 tribal people died in the ensuing fight, and many Tibetans were wounded and left on the pilgrimage trail. Then the Na and the Ra retreat down the Suban Seri and they disappear out of sight. Then Sarong went to the end of the pilgrimage and he stayed here for a month in Chayu and then went into the Na territory. What did he do? Paddy Boos, he planted tea. He did an experimental tea plantation on this land of the Na tribe who he had driven away with these British weapons that they were all carrying. He planted the tea, and he returned again, according to a single source. I don't have full authority for this, again in 1928 to check on it. But at the tea, he went in 28 with Lewis guns and again drove Na back down to the river gorges. The tea was there until 1947. It was ignored by the Na and then eventually burned by them as a kind of protest against the Tibetans. Alex has just told me I have 10 minutes, so maybe I'll the other examples I have all run along the same lines. Just let me summarize. The pattern is always the same. The Tibetans are pushing southward. They're pushing southward for 2 reasons. According to all these accounts we can verify, they want to extend their territorial control for either taxation reasons or commercial reasons, these kind of reasons. And they do it with violence, always with threat of armed force. Sometimes over in Pemakur, when there was at least between 1931 and 1946 annual tribute collecting missions that went way down into Shimong Minyong territory, 100 kilometers south of the command line. The tactic was that you took 300 armed members in your party. You threatened, first you gave salt to the local headman because everybody in the highlands needed salt desperately for all sorts of reasons, and the Tibetans had a bit of power over these tribal people because of the salt trade. You give salt as a present to the headman and tell all their subjects, they should tell all their subjects to give tax to these Tibetan tax collectors. But the leaders of this tax mission had 300 armed men behind them. But the worst thing for the local people was that they were told if they went to Tibet to try and get salt, they would be killed. And also, the 300 strong parties, at least in 1946 was the case, they demanded free porterage and free food all the way down, which was about 20 days travel back and forth. These people are subsistence farmers. They have no surplus ever, as they do swidden agriculture and hunting and gathering. They probably completely destroyed the local economy for some 3 or 4 months, just one of these missions. So the impact was high. Now, just to summarize a few points, why, given the aggression constantly from the south, from the north coming south from the Tibetans, did the Danese people keep a relationship with the Tibetans? Well, they needed commodities which were very important to them. Salt I mentioned, and with salt you contain the wild Meton ox. Meton was the standard currency, and it is today still in some places a currency. You buy brides with it. You use it for ritual sacrifice. You use it for prestige, owning a lot of metons. This is the wild forest ox. Without salt, you can't have the meton, you can't have a lot of other things. Cloth, because there were very few weaving traditions. No metal craft, so they got all the metalwares from the Tibetans, jewellery. The Dani wanted to keep trade monopolies. They wanted to keep their relationship with the Tibetans, the Highland Dani, so they could trade on further and make profit off of their southern neighbours, the other Dani speakers. They wanted to keep a balance of power, so everything would stay stable and orderly as they want. They were very conservative about territory. If you trespassed on the Dani tribe's territory, you had to pay compensation, as they did at Sari. No compensation, you were met with violence. And this is the way the Dani treated all their neighbours, the Tibetans included. So there was no special case when Dani attacked the Tibetans. They attacked each other using the same logic. From the Tibetan point of view, I think the critical features are these. Besides the fact that it was a stateless area, you could go and do what you want because there were no centralised political authorities. Just all these small tribal groups who were often at war with each other. Commodities that were rare and of high value. This was the main interest of Tibetan missions in here. When I say people went to get tax and tribute, the Tibetans demanded certain things. They demanded musk, bear's gore, deer's antler, all used for medicines or for trading onto further sources. They demanded wild animal skins. The skins of wild animals you couldn't get on the Tibetan plateau, like tiger and monkey and leopard. These were used by the elite, and I have hundreds of records of how Tibetans in all the elite stratas, including in the monasteries, used bear skins, tiger skins, and leopard skins, constantly, all the time. And that's why the ban on all these things that we're seeing today is very interesting. This is a complete reverse of what we used to do. Sir, or madder, is a dye used for dyeing monks' robes. This was all imported from this area. Freshwater crustacea, or the so-called Dixon. These freshwater crabs were used by Tibetan doctors, so it's another materia medica. Very important also were slaves and bonded labour. In the local dialects of Tibetan and Congo and southern Dakota, we call these people Nyumi, people who have been purchased. And there was a chronic labour shortage in many of these areas for the agricultural estates. And so the people were bought as slaves from the tribal groups. All the tribal groups practiced slave trading among themselves, and the Tibetans were just the northern extension of the market. And Tibetans bought many, many slaves in this whole, just north of this whole border area, and used them up until the 1950s. One of the reasons the so-called Loba are so important to the Chinese is that they are a great propaganda example to show how we took a slave society, the lowest on the scale of Marxist societies, and elevated it up to free men. So they use this idea that the Tibetan, and it's also an example for the Chinese propaganda of how evil the Tibetans were, that they kept old slaves. Anyway, the Tibetans, of course, also had interests in what I have already said, expanding territorial and taxation bases, and commercial activities like certain trading operations in Sarong's experimental tea gardens. So just to sum up now, thinking about what Tibetans were doing here and why they were doing it, the stateless political environment allowed Tibetans the license to undertake what were quite adventurous, I would say. There's a kind of adventurism often in these undertakings. They're high risk undertakings, but with potentially high rewards. And the rewards were mostly high value or rare commodities that you couldn't get from any other source. Only in the Far Eastern Himalaya did you have very rich sources of these products. And in fact, some of the products only came from this area. The nature of the Gundam program polity, with its tendency towards decentralization, the fact that local Dzungpen administrators served short periods of time without a lot of oversight from Lhasa. They could do profiteering missions. They could go and collect whatever they wanted from the south without any oversight from anybody above them, and they could personally profit. And it was generally considered normal behaviour for a Dzongpen to make a private profit during his 3-year term. And then they would go away and somebody else would come and repeat the same practice. We also have plenty of documentation of this pattern. But this particular aspect of Gundam program state as an administrative system allowed for this kind of Tibetan adventurism to the south in the eastern Himalaya. The willingness to use violence, of course, underpinned all of these things. And And the final point, it's neither here nor there to me what the McMahon represents from a political point of view, but it was there, and the British claimed it. The Tibetans in situ, whatever they may have said diplomatically, they continually disregarded the McMahon line, and we have so many examples of that, and just went to the south and did what they felt they needed to do. And this point is not really been brought out by the historians of the McMahon line well enough, I think. So that was it. Thank you very much for your attention.